Hello everyone, and welcome to another tutorial in WP Omaha. Today we're going to further our knowledge of dynamic blocks in WordPress and how to create them custom from scratch by going into some of the finer points of creating custom attributes and specific block controls for our block. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our channel to see more videos like this in the future, and let's get into it. If you remember from our previous video, we easily created a dynamic Gutenberg block, and here you can see we have the same exact block that we made from the last video. And as you can see, there's not really a whole lot we can do with our block. I mean, we can go into our render.php and we can change what it says, but otherwise it is what it is. And so we can't do anything like set and store specific values for our block without it affecting all other blocks that are of this type, this variant block example type. And so what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to go in on a block by block basis and set very specific values to the block so that we can make our block a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more variable. In Gutenberg, what we refer to these like pieces of data that differentiate one instance of our block from another instance of our block is called an attribute. And so you can think of block attributes very much like HTML attributes. So as you can see down here in this example, we've got the server-side render component that we talked about last time. And you can think of this block value as an attribute. If you're familiar with HTML, this shouldn't be really anything too new to you. Let's create a very basic element like an image element, for example. Most people have seen an image element, and most people that have written HTML for a while know that we've got the source equals attribute that we can put onto an image element, and that essentially allows us to tell the image element where the source is for our image. And so we would say our image.png or whatever, and then that's our attribute. And so if we make another image element, we know that this one could be entirely different. They're the same element, but each one can have different values passed in for the attribute. For all intents and purposes, are these the same element? Yes, they're the same element, but they may not necessarily show the same thing on the front end. And so that's a very important distinction to point out, and that is kind of where block attributes come in. Is we can put as many of these blocks on the page as we want, but what if we want this block to be somehow slightly different than the next block? We can essentially set what most people might think of as like custom settings or custom fields on our blocks to pass that information into the block. First, let's go ahead and kind of figure out where we want to add our block attributes. So when we go to put our attributes into our block, the most common place to do this is in the block.json. Now, there is a way where you could do this using an external attributes JavaScript file where you like import the whole object from a separate file. I would only do that if you have a lot of attributes for your block. But for simple blocks like this, we're just going to do it right here in the block.json. So let's start by creating an attributes part of our object here. That then takes another object, and let's pretty up this code a bit. And then now we just need to define what our attribute is going to be. Let's just call this audience. And then this is going to be of type string. All right, so here you can see we've got a new attribute on our block called audience, and it is the type of string. Once we have this, now our block knows that this is something where we need to store data about the block itself. So now we can go ahead and use this attribute in our edit area here. So when it comes to block controls, there's a few different types of them. I mean, we can just go into this paragraph block right up here, and you can see we've got quite a few controls that don't exist on this one. So the paragraph block has things like color and typography over here in what's referred to as the settings sidebar or the inspector controls component. And then over here in the regular block controls toolbar area, you can see we've got stuff like alignment options, and we can bold and italicize and create links. And there's quite a few other block controls that exist in the paragraph block. Even though it is a simple and widely used block, it's actually a fairly complex block. So we're not trying to create anything quite this complex yet. Let's start small, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can add something to our settings sidebar over here. We could also do this, we could create a toggle or something up here in the toolbar, but since we're trying to add like dynamic text, and we're probably going to use a text input to do that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to put our text input up here in this toolbar, so we're going to put it over here in our settings sidebar area. So then the question is, okay, well, how do we do this? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that anytime you want to put something into the settings sidebar area, we need to use the inspector controls component in order to do that. This comes from the block editor itself. So if we just go up to where we're importing use block props, and we add something else in here, we can import additional things from block editor besides just use block props. And what we want to import is inspector controls. And now, if we go down above where we have our server-side render component here, and we use the inspector controls element, everything works beautifully. Now, just for demonstration purposes and to make sure that everything's working, what I'm going to do is just type in some demo text here. So I'm just going to say, is this working? And then also be sure to note that I've already run npm start down here in the terminal on this plugin. Webpack is actively watching for changes in this edit file and recompiling my code in the build directory as I save. So now if we go over here and refresh, it's actually just update and refresh. And now if we click on one of our blocks here, you can see over in the right hand side, we can see our text, is this working? So clearly the answer to that question is yes, it is working. So, but you can see that this doesn't look very pleasing to the eye, doesn't look nearly as pretty as this. And so you're like, okay, well, how do we make it look like separated into these different sections and get it to look all pretty and all that stuff? Well, we need to start thinking about additional components that are built into Gutenberg. And there is a giant library of standard React components that exist in Gutenberg that we can leverage to add a wide variety of inputs and settings and fields and different things within Gutenberg itself. There is a big list of them out on the WordPress Codex. However, I find it a bit more visually helpful to go look up the Storybook page for all of the Gutenberg blocks. And I will put a link to this webpage in the description below. This is something really nice that the people at WordPress put together. If you're not familiar with what Storybook is a open source project that allows people that create things like web components and React components and basically any kind of components in general to put them all into a storybook so that you can kind of have a demo area for your different components. So you can see, like, if I go down to the base control component here, this gives me kind of a playground area on the right that demonstrates what's going on with this component. And by default, this is going to probably show in the Canvas tab. I just had it on Docs tab, but yeah, if you put it on the Canvas tab and then you just click through some of these, basically it'll show you like what that component looks like and what it does on the right hand side. And then it shows you some of the various controls for that component down below. We're not interested in either of these components. The main component that we want to use to start organizing all of our custom fields, if you want to think of them like that, is this panel component. This component is exactly what you're seeing when we go over here and look at some of these other parts of the sidebar over here. Anytime you see somewhere where you can like open and close this is referred to as a panel. And so essentially what we should try to do is get all of our custom settings into a nice little panel over here that we can like minimize and maximize. If we go back over here and look at the panel, and then you go to this docs tab, it'll show, you can see there's like an area right here that says show code. We can go in here and just click on show code, and it'll show us like exactly how this part of things are coded. Basically over here where we're importing our stuff from the block editor, we need to also import our components one at a time in the same way we're doing them here, but not from the same package. These are in different packages. There's a package that WordPress manages, like an npm package, that's specifically for all the Gutenberg components. Type import here. We need to import this from @WordPress. And then the package that we specifically want is components. And then the specific component that we want in this case is our panel component. Now that we've got the panel component there, we can go inside of our inspector controls, and instead of just putting "is this working," we can type panel. And then panels can take a variety of arguments. You can think of it as arguments, but essentially they're attributes, not to be confused with the block attributes that we were talking about earlier. This is more of a component level attribute. And so you can see where it says panel header, we can give it a name here. So let's just go ahead and do that and see what that does. And I'm just going to leave it as my panel. And then we're also going to need a panel body. No point in wasting time refreshing and all that stuff. We're just going to like add one of these panel bodies in here. Now what you'll notice here is that my editor is like squiggly underlined all this stuff right here. And the reason it's done that is because we haven't imported these components yet. Panel component and panel body and panel row are all three different React components. And so we need to go up here and import all of those as well. So now that we have all those imported, you can see our squiggly lines are gone, and that just indicates that we are good to go here. And then now we can go ahead and just say, we are ready for our first setting. And then I'm going to change this panel body here to reflect the example that we're using. So I'm just going to call this audience. And then I'm going to save. Node is going to do its thing and rebuild our JavaScript for us. And then we're going to refresh over here and click on our block. And here you can see we've got my panel right here. And then there's this audience area. And you can see that when I open and close audience, it says we are ready for our first setting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to replace our "we are ready for our first setting." We don't need this text anymore. Let's actually put the field that we want in there so that we can input our variable text. So we're going to go back over to the Storybook, and I'm going to show you the next component we're going to use from in here, and that is going to be the text control component. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that whatever value we type into this field, it's going to get stored on the block level, so that in our render.php file, we can then call this value and have it dynamically change what the text is in the block when we present it on the page. So let's go ahead and add our text control component. I'm just going to keep appending these here. And then once you get to a lot of these that are separated by commas, a common convention you'll see is people will line break between each one. so that you've got kind of a nice pretty list of all of the different components that you're using in this block. So we'll just leave it like that. And then now we can go ahead and replace this with our text control. And then it's going to ask for a few attributes here. The first thing I think we probably want to give it is a label so that we can tell the admin user kind of what is supposed to go in here. We're going to call this label audience name. And then we're going to add another attribute here in a second, but I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. Let's just make sure that this shows up in here and we're kind of getting what we expect. Okay, great. So now you can see that we have audience name here and we can just type whatever. So if I wanted this to be WP Omaha, or maybe we make it dynamic WordPress group, or maybe we make it advanced WordPress group, whoever it might be, we want to make sure that on a block by block basis, we can change what this text says down here, depending on what we have entered into this text box. So there's a little bit more that we have to do than just type this in. The problem is that when I click this and I enter this text in, you can see that we don't have the ability to update because it's not really registering any change has been made. You can see if I change which block I selected, it changes, like it basically blows away what we typed in here. And that's not great. What we want to do is we want to make sure that whenever we type something in here, our block remembers this value. So how do we do that? Well, all of these components that are in this storybook come with an attribute that's very important called onChange. And this isn't specific to these components. OnChange is actually on many elements across HTML, so you might be familiar with it from that. And we also need to add some functions in here to allow for the change to happen when the user changes the value in the text field. So let's go ahead and add this attribute in here on change, and then we're going to essentially call a function here. So what is our function? We can call it whatever we want. We haven't really defined it yet. In this case, I'm going to call it change audience name. And so as you can see, it's got little squigglies under it because it doesn't know what that is, which is fine. Now what we need to do is above our return, but under the default function for edit, we want to start defining some things here. Our block was very simple before and didn't have any kind of internal functionality built into it. And so now what we're starting to do is add some internal functionality to our block, which changes the complexity of how all this looks. So let's go ahead and define our function. So we want to say function, change audience name. And now we have a function, and as you can see here, my code editor at the bottom recognizes that these two things are associated with each other, and so now we have no squigglies. And essentially what's going to happen here is anytime we change something in this text control box, it's going to fire this function. Now right now our function isn't doing anything, so now we got to talk about how to make these functions. I like to refer to the WordPress codex for information like this, and I'll put a link to this page in the description below. But if we go to the block controls page in the developer resources for WordPress.org, you can see that it outlines kind of a lot of the stuff that we've already been talking about. Block controls, here's an example of what the block toolbar is and some examples of like how we can add stuff to the block toolbar, and then the settings sidebar that we're talking about right now and how we can do some of that. And you can see there's some handy little example code in here. We're going to just lift some of this code because this is exactly what we need. If we look in this example right here, you can see that it says our on change for the color palette, and it refers to a function that's up here, on change text color. And so if we go up here and we look at on change text color, you can see that that is what this is for. It sets the attribute and then passes in the value. And so basically what we end up getting passed in is the value of whatever they typed into that input box. So in this case, we can make this audience name. And then we want to go and set attributes. And as you can see here on the right, what it wants is an object. And the reason why we're doing this object is because it makes it very easy to target exactly which attribute we want to set. So we want the first thing we passed in here to be the exact name of our attribute as we defined it in block.json, which is audience. And so we can just put audience here. And then we want to pass in whatever value, and the value we want is the value that we got from the text box, which is this audience name. And there you go. So this is going to set the attribute for this block's audience attribute to the input of this text control. Now, before we go trying to test this out or anything like that, we do need to note a couple of things. Once we start using attributes in our block, we do need to pass some additional things in while we're editing the block, basically. Right now, we're not passing anything into the edit function. We need to change that. There are optional parameters that can be passed into edit, and we're not using any right now, but now that we're going to start using attributes and such, we are going to need some. So the first one we're going to type in here is attributes, and then we also need to pull in the set attributes function here. And then now our set attributes is defined. So now that we have all of this passed in, and we can rest assured that our attributes are being set, the next thing we're probably going to want to do is make sure that once the attribute is set, we want to pass that value into the text control so that when we go back to this block, we can actually see the value of the attribute pre-populated. So not only when we're switching from block to block, but obviously if we refresh the page and everything, we'll want to make sure that when we click on this block, it shows whatever we typed in previously. So that's where we leverage the attributes, which I didn't type correctly up there. And then we want to refer to this as attributes.audience, because that's what that is. And then let's change the spelling of this to be correct. And now we can go over here and refresh our page. Click on here. Now we can type in our audience. And you can see when we click between multiple blocks, it remembers our setting, unlike before where it would clear the field every time. And you can see the update field, or the update button, is highlighted again because it knows that something changed in the editor. So let's just go ahead and click update, and let's go ahead and refresh this page as if we left the editor and came back, and click on this block and see if it remembers. And it sure does. It remembers that the audience name in this block specifically is supposed to be WP Omaha. So now we can go down to this next block, and let's just go ahead and say, okay, I want this one to be advanced WordPress Facebook group, and click update. And now you can see when we select each of these blocks, it remembers that this block down here is for the advanced WordPress Facebook group, and this one up here is for WP Omaha. So great, this is awesome. Now you might notice that down here it does not reflect that in the server-side rendered stuff, and we still need to do an additional step, which is we need to make sure that our PHP function pulls in these attributes and their values and echoes the values in the PHP. So if we go into our render.php you'll see that we still have this text is just hard coded in the PHP file, and that's not ideal. We don't want to do that. Before we go replacing some of the stuff here, we should go back to our edit.js, and we need to change a little bit about how our server-side render component works so that we can see these changes reflected in the editor real time. So what we need to do is add the attributes argument here, and then pass in our attributes from up above. All right, now over on our render file, here you can see we have our static text here, and that's great. We want to replace this static text, but I'm just going to eliminate this whole thing to simplify stuff a bit, because now we're going to be using more variable data in the PHP template. So the first thing I'm going to do is I just want everybody to see kind of what the data looks like so that it's easier to understand what's going on under the hood, and that way we can put it together in a better fashion. The variable that we need to leverage to get our attribute data is just called attributes. So if we just do a print har here on attributes, we save that and ignore the fact that this is red underlined and go in here and refresh, you'll see that we get an array, an associative array of our attributes, and you can see our data is in there. I find this particularly useful to do sometimes while I'm developing, just so that I can understand what's going on under the hood and see, okay, there's an array there I can use and it's got some data in it. So this means that if I wanted to print out a specific thing, I could just say echo, this block is specifically for, and then I can concatenate on attributes, and then we can target the various parts of our associative array by the name of our attribute. And now we don't need to print this anymore because we already know what's in there. And if we click save and go over here and refresh, you'll see now it says this block is specifically for WP Omaha, and this block is specifically for Advanced WordPress Facebook group. Now, here's an issue that I have is I don't necessarily like the fact that my editor is flagging this variable as an error. The reason it's doing that is because it's claiming that this is an undefined variable. It doesn't know where we set the value of this variable. Now, on the back end of WordPress, it's kind of like shoving that data into this variable for us, much like it works when you pass in args for like a get template or get template part, which I also have the same issue on those as well. I don't know what to do about this. I don't know if there's like another line of HTML I could say here. Like I tried doing a global attributes here, and you know, that solves the problem here in my editor. But it doesn't solve the problem here in the block because now it's confused and doesn't know what attributes is because attributes isn't set as a global variable. So if anybody knows what to do about this issue right here, I would love to know the answer. Please comment in the comments below if you know what to do about the fact that my editor doesn't realize that attributes is being defined outside of this. And maybe there's nothing that can be done about it. I don't know. But nevertheless, this works. And so now we can even try some fun stuff. Like we can go over here and change this to something else. Like we can say, let's just say WP Kansas City. And you can see it changes like immediately. Once it registers the change, it re-renders the whole block and that specific part of it. So now if I change this to Omaha, you can see it says Omaha and it's missing the space. So I can do that. And so it's nice that like as you change things over here in the side panel, it does change things immediately over on the block itself. And that's kind of how all of these kind of custom fields that we're creating, that's how they'll always work. even if you're not setting the value that's inside the block, even if you're setting attributes or if you're changing the class on the block dynamically, there's lots of different things we can do with these settings here. The nice thing about all of this being built on React is that you're going to see the changes to the block immediately in the editor down here. And I find that to be a lot cooler than using ACF blocks, because with ACF blocks, it doesn't do that. You can't just see your dynamic data real time reflected in the block like it's going to show on the front end. Now, speaking of the front end, we can just go over here to the front end and refresh the page, and you'll see everything is working as expected, and it's pulling that data in properly. So that's one simple example of one attribute that we're manipulating with the custom field we just created here. And we can create an unlimited amount of custom fields. We can go ahead and just add one more just for fun. So let's go ahead and look at some of these other components that we can use. There's a lot of them. There's little snack bars you could put in there. There's the select control is another like commonly used one. It's a little bit finicky to work with because you do have to like set which value should be selected by default in here. So look out for that. Another fun one is there's like a little pill toggle in here. Yeah, the toggle control. This is like nice and handy and fun to use if you want to enable or disable certain settings. So actually, let's just go ahead and use this just for the purposes of this talk. We'll just go and look at the docs for this real quick and find out how to pull the toggle control in. So here you can see it's just called toggle control. So now we'll just repeat what we did earlier. And we'll go down here, we'll just add another row. And we'll change this to our toggle control. And let's call this show. Let's do show icon. As before, we'll need to create an attribute and all this stuff. So we do need to go into block props, go into here, add another one of these. Obviously, we don't want to call it audience. We'll just call it icon. And then for this type, instead of putting it as a string, let's just make it a Boolean. And then let's go in here and we need to create another function real quick. So we'll just copy paste this other function. We'll call it change icon. We'll call it change show icon. And then we'll just copy the name of this function. We'll put it down here. And then for a value, we'll put this to icon. And then we just change all of our naming convention stuff here. So here we can just say show icon, and everything is looking good here. Now we just need to figure out what it means to show the icon. So actually, like before, let's just go ahead and do a print R here to see that data in the attributes variable. It gets automatically shoved in here. And I think now we should be able to go back and refresh the page. Okay, cool. Click on this. Here's our icon. We can click show icon. Now you can see it says icon is equal to 1. If we click it again, icon is false. But we do have a problem here where for some reason it's not like animating the toggle button like we want it to. Let's go ahead and fix that. Now the reason that it's not animating this thing is because this toggle needs a specific static attribute put into it in order to do that. And I'll show you real quick. If we go back to the toggle control storybook here, you can see that if we want it to be checked, we have to pass in this attribute called checked, right? And so if we just put checked in here and save it, and then go back to our page and refresh, what you're going to notice now is that now it's always on. So then the question is, okay, well, how do we make this variable? And this is how we do this in JSX. And the nice thing about JSX is that it will automatically not put this checked attribute on what it renders unless this right here resolves to true. If that resolves to false, then checked will never be added in here as an attribute. So now if we save this and go back over here and refresh, and we click on our block, now when we select it, it slides over, and you can see our value is set to 1 down here, and when we deselect it, likewise. And so what that means is that we no longer need this value because this value doesn't do what we thought it was going to do. And we should probably put a label on this so that the admin knows what this slider is even for. And so we're just going to put show icon here. And now we can go ahead and refresh. It's going to keep telling me, asking me if I want to reload because I keep changing that value. And here you can see show icon. We check it. Yes, it's set to true down here. We update it. We refresh the page, and now this is still set to show icon, and this one is not set to show icon. So now we can go down here, and in our render, because right now, if we go to the front end now, it's not doing anything. We're not using that value to do anything. So let's go ahead and take this out now, because we've already seen that again. We know what's there. And then now what we can do is we could say if, and then just say attributes icon. If attributes icon, then echo. All right, and then now we're just going to use a dash icon here because I know that they're readily available in WordPress and I don't want to import a whole icon library. So I'm just going to paste in the markup for the album icon. And then we do need to be careful here. If we just try to access something that is in an array that doesn't exist, so you can see here it's got icon is 1, but down here there is no icon at all, then we will get a PHP warning. So we do need to be careful of that. Let's make sure that doesn't happen. So we want to put an additional check in here. And that check is just going to be if is set and that. So what'll happen here is that if it looks to see, first it'll look to see if the icon is set on the array. And if it is, then it'll test to see what the value of that is, and then we won't get a warning. So now we can go back and we can go to this page and refresh. And now you can see that we've got the icon showing down here, and then down here we don't. And so let's go ahead and just put like a space at the end of this so that that doesn't like squeeze up there all ugly. And we could obviously add CSS to change that and all that good jazz. So there you go. We've added 2 custom fields essentially to our blocks, and our blocks look exactly the same in the editor as that. Well, not exactly the same because we're using slightly different CSS between the two. We could easily fix that with CSS, but I'm not going to waste everybody's time doing that. But just know that we can make it so that our block looks exactly the same in the editor as it does on the front end. And as you can see, we can go in here and change this to whatever we want, and we can turn the icon on and off, and everything works beautifully. Yeah. One other thing to note here is that this is not the only way to add custom fields to your blocks. If there's a custom field that already exists in the Block Supports library, you should look into using those. That's how we add common functionality between blocks. So a good example would be like the text align Here on the paragraph, if you are wanting to create a block that leverages that same functionality where you can control the text alignment on the block itself, instead of creating a whole custom field like we just did to add this, you can just add a block support to this block and it will just manage all that for you. If you want to know more about block supports, I'll put a link in the description below of the area in the documentation for block supports. It's much easier than what we just did. So just something to note there. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching this tutorial. I hope you all learned a little bit about how to add custom fields to blocks and how block attributes work and how we create the functions for the change and all that good jazz. Thanks, everyone.